Hi friends, welcome to Sabbath School Daily, where we have been studying from this lesson right here, 3 Cosmic Messages. This week we've been studying from lesson number 6, which has the title, The Hour of His Judgment. And today's lesson is Thursday's lesson, which has the title, The Year 1844. Now this week we've been talking specifically about the prophecies that we find in Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 9. In Daniel 8:14 we find the biggest time prophecy, the longest time prophecy in the entire Bible of the 2300-day prophecy, right? The 2,300 years. And then in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 through 27, we find the first portion of that larger time prophecy. And that portion is cut off. Remember that we use the word chatak, that defines being cut off, right? So you have 70 weeks that in biblical prophecy, using the day-year principle, you find 490 prophetic days, which come out to 490 literal years, which are the first period of that larger 2,300 year prophecy. And so that prophecy, the bigger one, begins in the year 457 BC, as per Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 and 25, with Artaxerxes' order to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. The 490-year prophecy finishes in the year 34 AD. And from that moment all the way to the conclusion of the larger time prophecy, we have 1,810 years left. And so the date comes out to 1844, right? 1844. That year is extremely significant to Seventh-day Adventists because, well, before there were even Seventh-day Adventists, you had this movement that began with William Miller. William Miller was a veteran from the War of 1812. And he didn't really start off as a particularly religious person. He defined himself as agnostic. But seeing everything that he saw in the war and going through all the experiences, the traumatic experiences of war, he decided that he wanted to get his life right with God. And so he started studying the Bible. He studied it, verse per verse. He had a Cruden's Concordance right next to him. And just going through the Bible, he found prophecies such as the prophecies of Daniel chapter 8, chapter 9, the whole book of Daniel, really, chapter 2, that defines and outlays the statue of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. He found the prophecies that are in Revelation chapter 10 that really refer to, to this period of time. He didn't really connect what was going on in Revelation 10 with 1844, at least not at that first moment, because his conclusion was that the year 1844 was the year in which Jesus was going to come back. And his whole mistake, the whole problem with his interpretation was on the definition of the term, the cleansing of the sanctuary. You see, when he reads in Daniel 8:14 that the sanctuary would be cleansed after 2,300 days, prophetic days, he concluded that Jesus was going to come back, right? And so he got excited, he preached, and he told people, and after a while, this is a movement that went all over the world. And when Jesus did not come back, it was a great disappointment, right? It was extremely bitter. And this is where you see the connection with Revelation 10, where you have the angel telling John to eat the little scroll. That little scroll is the prophecies of the book of Daniel. And in his mouth is extremely sweet. The message that Jesus was coming back in 1844 was an extremely sweet message. But when Jesus ended up not coming back, it was extremely bitter, right? And so that's where you get the bitterness in the stomach when the message is digested, when the scroll is digested. And so the big problem, right, the error in that interpretation was the definition of the term, the cleansing of the sanctuary. You see, later on, when they did go back to the Bible to try to find what they got wrong, they found out that the cleansing of the sanctuary is a term that only appears in connection to the Day of Atonement. And the Day of Atonement is something that has nothing to do with Jesus' second coming. It has nothing to do with the conclusion, with the ending of all things, but with part of the process, right? And so if you go back to, for example, Leviticus chapter 16, you'll see that, all of Leviticus chapter 16 has to do with the Day of Atonement. So if you want more information on it, just read the whole of the chapter. But if you focus on chapter 16, verse 16, you'll have it where it says, so he shall make atonement for the holy place because of the uncleanliness of the children of Israel and because of their transgressions for all their sins. And so he shall do for the tabernacle of the meeting, which remains among them in the midst of their uncleanliness. So if there's something that I want you to understand about the Day of Atonement is that the Day of Atonement, first of all, the Day of Atonement really didn't have anything to do with forgiveness. Forgiveness happened with the daily offerings, right? So the Day of Atonement, it didn't settle the matter of forgiveness. There was no forgiveness involved. Of course, it's connected to the concept of forgiveness because throughout the entire year, when the children of Israel would bring their sacrifices, or even when you had the daily sacrifice happening twice a day, those had to do with forgiveness, right? With asking forgiveness. But on the Day of Atonement, it wasn't as much about forgiveness as it was about atonement, right? It was God dealing with the problem of sin. I told you earlier this week that sin is a human problem. When Adam and Eve fell, it became a human problem. But the moment when God decided to forgive sin, sin became God's problem. And so the Day of Atonement is God dealing with that problem. You see, in a very mysterious way, sin never disappears. Sin never disappears. Sin is transferred. When the children of Israel sinned, they would take their sacrifice to the temple, to the sanctuary, the temple later on. They would slay the sacrificial lamb. They would transfer their sin to the sanctuary, to the priests, which were part of the whole sacrificial, system, the sanctuary system, and the sin would reside upon the sanctuary. And then on the Day of Atonement, that sin would be cleansed from the sanctuary. And where did it go? Well, the sin was then transferred to heaven, to the heavenly sanctuary, right? We know that Jesus is the sacrificial lamb. He died on the cross for us. But sin, friends, in a likewise way, even today, when we ask for forgiveness, sin is transferred from us and it goes up to heaven, to the heavenly sanctuary. On 1844, we believe that Jesus, he began to deal with that. He began to cleanse the sanctuary as the Day of Atonement in the Old Testament foreshadowed. So you might be wondering, well, you're saying, Pastor, that sin never disappears? Well, what kind of, biblical theology is that? Well, sin does disappear. Ultimately, it does disappear at the executive judgment. That's where you finally have all sin, all sinners, the devil, those who instigate sin. You have the problem of sin being completely vanquished from the universe. Up to that moment, you will have sin in the universe. Won't you have Lucifer? Won't you have the dragon that is imprisoned here on earth? So if you still have the devil somewhere, you still have sin, you still have a sinner, and you still have the father of sin. Of course, when Jesus comes back and you have, the righteous being taken to heaven, you have the unrighteous, all of them dying, and there being no humans left here on earth, you do have no more human sin or human sinners at that point. But sin is completely and truly ended after the millennium, right? When Jesus comes back after the millennium, when the New Jerusalem comes back. But I really hope that makes sense. Up to that point, it makes sense. Sin it never truly disappears, and it will only be completely vanquished from the universe after the millennium. It will be vanquished from humans at the second coming. But in the Old Testament, that's what the cleansing of the sanctuary, it foreshadowed, right? That's what it represented. It was God dealing with atonement, right? In 1844, when Jesus, he took upon himself the role of the high priest, what we see happening, and this is something that I feel not a lot of people really understand, right? It shouldn't be that complicated for us to understand what the Day of Atonement up in heaven and the investigative judgment, what these things mean. You see, all the way up to 1844, Jesus was playing the role of a priest. So what did the priests do? The priests, they had to do with intercession. They worked with intercession. That's what the priests did throughout the entire year, where the children of Israel would come and they would bring their sacrificial lamb. And, the priests worked towards intercession. They interceded for the people, right? But the high priest on the Day of Atonement, he would take an additional role, not only working intercession, but adding on the role of atonement, right? Of working atonement, of cleansing the sanctuary. That's what the high priest did. So likewise, in the same manner, Jesus in 1844, he began his work of atonement, of atoning for everything that had happened up to that point and everything that was going to happen from that moment on. So Jesus took upon himself the work of the high priest, of atoning for sin. And that's where the cleansing of the sanctuary takes an important role, right? That's where it finds its meaning, right? But the interesting thing in this whole subject, and this is what I want to focus on, I know that I've already gone a little bit farther than usual, but what I want you to understand is that the children of Israel also had a role to play, right? They also had something to do on the Day of Atonement. It wasn't something that had only to do with the high priest or with the sanctuary. There was an attitude that was expected of the children of Israel on that day. And you'll find that in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 26, and let's read through 27. Leviticus 23, 26 through 27. It says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Also the 10th day of this 7th month shall be the day of atonement. It shall be a holy convocation for you. You shall afflict your souls and offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. And you shall do no work on that same day, for it is the day of atonement, to make atonement for you before the Lord your God. For any person who is not afflicted in soul on that same day shall be cut off from his people." So that goes all the way up to verse 29. So there was this element of affliction of soul. What does it mean to afflict your soul, right? It sounds, why am I afflicting my soul? Friends, the Day of Atonement, both in ancient Israel and nowadays we call it the eschatological Day of Atonement, the true Day of Atonement, right? It's what the Day of Atonement all the way back then, it's what it pointed towards. The Day of Atonement today, just like it was then, these are moments where we, friends, have to consider and we have to contemplate on our lives. How am I living? Am I waiting for my Lord? Am I waiting to meet him? On that day, the children of Israel, they would come together in a holy convocation to meet the Lord, right? The Day of Atonement was also called the Day of Judging. Remember how we talked about that judging is good news in the Bible, right? That was last week. Judgment is good news for those who believe in Jesus, for those who have deposited their faith in him, who have accepted the justification provided by Jesus, the righteousness by faith provided by Jesus, and that's good news for them, right? But the sentiment, the attitude is still one of affliction, of me understanding everything that God went through to be able to do that for me to understand the depth of human sin, the depth of the separation that sin causes, how abhorrent it is to God, how horrible it is to God, and how much we await the new heavens and the new earth. And so if I am not afflicting my soul, right, if I am not cognizant, if I am not acknowledging this reality, well, am I truly waiting for the Lord? Am I truly waiting to meet him? Am I acknowledging what Jesus has done on the cross, what he's doing today for me in heaven? So that's what acknowledging the afflicting of the soul represents. It represents that in everything that I do, I am going to acknowledge that God cares for me, that God loves me, that God has gone through hell, right? Jesus died the second death for me. Friends, in Jesus, heaven has emptied itself of its most precious resource. And so, am I living for that? That's why, as Seventh-day Adventist Christians, we should strive our best to live a godly life, not because we're going to gain salvation by doing that. Salvation is already ours, friends. Through Christ, salvation is already ours. So living a godly life, living a God-fearing life, it has to do as a response to this contemplation, to this affliction of soul, of understanding, of acknowledging, of living by what God has done for me, and living looking forward to what God is going to do when he comes back for us. So I hope that that's kind of cleared up what all of this is about, what was done in 1844. I'm sure that there is always more to learn about this. So I would urge you, study the Bible, study prophecy, study Revelation chapter 10, study Daniel chapter 8 and 9, study Leviticus 16 and 23. I'm sure that the Lord will reveal more to you. You find really the ending point of today's lesson in Revelation chapter 14, verses, this is what the lesson points to. Revelation 14, verse 6 and 7. Revelation 14, verse 6 and 7 says this: "Then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water." This is a calling, friends, for us to leave a false system of worship, right? We see that in the continuation of the three angels' message. This is a call for us to fear God, to worship him, to truly worship him, to give him honor by acknowledging, by afflicting the soul in contemplation of everything that God has done for us. I hope that God blesses you. Please don't forget to study your lesson. Look up the Bible verses. fill out the questions. I'm sure that the Lord will inspire you and reveal even more so that you can share this message. Please remember to like, to share, and to subscribe to our videos. We release one every day, and I hope to see you again here tomorrow for another study of Sabbath School Daily.